We fly in airplanes a lot, and it's remarkably safe. Didn't we just hear that there were no deaths from aviation in the last year? It is quite remarkable because it's quite complicated in my mind to fly a big machine into the sky and land it in a crowded airport, and yet we managed to do it. Now, why can't we manage to have a safe financial system? It's only because we don't seem to have people at the top who want that. My name is Anat Admati, and I'm a professor of finance and economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Banks prefer to use as much as possible essentially other people's money in the sense that it's money that they promised to pay back, like to depositors or other creditors. And so their favorite way to fund whatever they do is not to go to the local venture capitalist and get money to invest and take risk with like they do in Silicon Valley, but instead to go to governments, go to other lenders to say, hey, here's an asset as a collateral and you can take it back. Make promises, IOUs, debt. And they prefer to put as little as possible of money that is actually at risk, that would have to absorb losses into investments. Now, when you invest with so much sort of debt overhang, you're very fragile. Any little change, any non-payment by a loan of somebody you lent to or any other kind of shock, you can't absorb. And so then it's like everybody's problem. In addition to that, of course, there's all the ways in which the banks report the value of their assets. So a lot of opacity in all this interconnected system that's gotten worse and worse over the years. So there's a lot of risk that's taken that we really just can't see. And so the combination of being a very opaque system, very complex system as it's become globally, and then the massive use, the unusual and completely unnecessary extensive use of debt funding makes them very fragile. So the only question is that a good thing, or is that something that we somehow accepted as okay? And unfortunately, the answer is the latter, because nobody seems to be able to counter enough those incentives to take risk, high risk, and sort of magnify that risk with the use of debt. These problems are not new, and they really haven't changed. So if you go back hundreds of years, when they say banks have always been fragile, it just basically is another way of saying they've never really been an efficient industry. They've always had symbiotic relations with governments. They've always been sort of the governments failing on the banks fail on and need government support. So there's always these unhealthy relations. So no, not that much has changed. It morphs into different forms, but fundamentally it's the same problem, and not very much has changed despite all the narratives. To take care of the opacity of the system, I would really want now to understand more of everybody's commitment to everybody. I think that there's so many layers in this system, and I think technology by now, as we've increased the global nature of this system so that it's not like your local institution lending in your neighborhood, but it's massive global corporations, with central banks and governments all around the world. I think it's absolutely essential that we begin to sort of identify all the connections, and I think it's doable. I think there were some initiatives to do legal identification of contracts and all of that. So I sometimes like to compare the safety and soundness of this system to the safety and soundness of aviation. You could sit at control towers in various places coordinating across the globe to do just like you do for aviation. So you have to do that, and then you have to make sure that loss absorption does not fall on people. And if you want to subsidize anything through the financial system, you want to subsidize housing, small business lending, anything you want to subsidize, you have to find better ways to subsidize than to throw cheap money at the banks, which is sort of the way we try to stimulate the economy, where the banks would do what they'll do, because except for political bargains, they'll want to maximize their returns or the profits or the bonuses. It doesn't really work for us to kind of say, hey, here's some cheap money, do something good with it, and hope for that they do what we want them to do. So we need to make sure that there aren't as many conflicts of interest between what banks want to do and what the economy needs. Martin Habig and I, in our book, give specific recommendation, and in research even since then, that's just about to come out as a theoretical paper that really guides the actual tools that regulators have. We're not even recommending at the levels that we have right now to play around with all these capital ratios. These regulatory capital ratios have not really been useful, and they can really mislead you because of the numerous ways in which they can be manipulated by the banks. They rely on accounting numbers, they rely on all kinds of risk weights and all kinds of scientific fine-tuning that's not worked for us because fundamentally the numbers are wrong. But the tools that the regulators have to counter exactly what the incentives are, like, for example, forcing retentions of earnings so that you do anything but pay it out. So you don't even give a ratio, but you just say exactly an amount of more equity funding that is already there, sometimes in profits, or that if the banks can't raise, they're really telling us that they're too unhealthy to survive, and we got to deal with that. So if you let and forbear and let zombies kind of keep the dysfunction that they have, you have an unhealthy system. So what we are saying is, you got to see the symptoms of unhealthy banks and kind of do something with them, bring them to health or unwind them or something like that would actually improve the system. And you got to go to some other elements, including consumer protection, some respect, some potential issues about household indebtedness that sometimes we discuss. And again, gear whatever it is that we want to support as a society, as government, in a most straightforward way, as opposed to always through certain intermediaries like banks. So we may not need as much of that. We're just propping it up and propping it up.